What's up, YouTube friends? So finally, it's only been about 3 years, we're finally going to finish our Quilt Block Sampler Quilt Top. So if you remember way back when, we made a series of 12-inch blocks, and each one was a different fabric and a different pattern. And I used scraps that I had, and I bought very little fabric for these blocks. So today we're going to put this quilt top together and try to crank out a quilt this weekend. Now I'll be using this blue fabric for the border, and I love black, so I'm going to do black binding and a black sashing. And I also have some blue backing. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to use this or not. It might be too much blue. If not, I do have a bunch of sheets behind me on the shelf. And then just a little side note, I got these baskets at the Dollar Tree and I love them for my quilts. They stack really nicely. I put all my fabric in them and they go on the shelf very nicely. I can see through what project is what. So just a little side tip. So this quilt top is going to be 5 blocks across and 5 blocks down. So I'm going to go downstairs and lay this out the way I want it. And honestly, I think I'm just going to lay it out in the order that we did them in the videos. And I'll show you what that looks like. Now I laid them out pretty much how we sewed them together, so all the easier ones were kind of here at the top, and it just gets more difficult, or more advanced I should say, towards the bottom. I did swap a couple of them around if it was too matchy-matchy. I did this one was next to this one, and I ended up separating it with this blue one, just because it looked a little too matchy-matchy. So now we're just going to sew this together in rows, so I went ahead and got 6 pieces of scrap paper. I numbered them 1 through 6. And I put 1 paper on each of the beginning blocks. Next, I'm just going to stack these up and take them up to the sewing room and sew them together. So I'm going to take block 1 and I'm going to lay it on top of this block. Then I'm going to lay all 2 of those on top of that block, and so on until I have 6 rows of 5 blocks. So this is my first stack. So I'm going to take my number 1 and put it right here. Then I'm just going to take my second block and I'm going to lay it face down. And whenever possible, I am going to nest my seams and nestle them together. So one will go one way and the other one will go the opposite way, just so it lays nice and flat. So just like that. These will kind of lock in together, and then I'll just stick a pin. So I'm just going to take this over to my sewing machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. I'm going to start right up here and sew all the way down. When I'm done with that, I'm going to open this up, take my 3rd block, and do the same thing until I have 6 rows. Alright guys, so here is the finished quilt top. Now we just need to add a 2.5 inch black sashing, and I haven't decided how big I want the border to be, so we'll do that in the next step. So now you just want to cut 8 2.5 inch strips, and that'll be for our sashing. And now we just need to join these together. So I'm going to join them together at a diagonal. So with one facing up, I'm going to put the other one face down. And then I'm just going to sew from this corner down to this corner. So now I'm just going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and I'm just going to sew corner to corner. So that way when we open this up, it'll be one continuous piece, but you won't have a lot of bulk in the seam right there. So I'm going to do that to all 8 of my strips. And it should look like that. So now I'm just going to come back with my scissors and I'm going to trim this seam allowance down to a 1/4 inch. And then just snip off these little dog ears. And then take it over to your ironing board and give it a good press. So I like to start with the long sides first. And so you just want to find the middle of your quilt. Then I'm just going to find the middle of my sashing strip. And I'm going to line them up so the right sides are touching, and then throw some pins. So I'm going to do this to the other side also, And then I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew this on with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. When I'm done with that, I'm going to trim any of the extra sashing, and then I'm just going to do the same thing on the top and the bottom. I'll bring you right back. So here's what it looks like with the sashing on. I try to get as much of it in this frame as I can. I think I got most of it. Right now it's about 62 inches by 74 inches, which will be a perfect lap size quilt, but I'm a big beefy beast and I need a lot more fabric to cover my buns. So I'm going to add a border to this, and I'm going to do a 6-inch border. My fabric is 108 inches wide that I'll be using, so I'm only going to need 4 pieces. But if you're going to use just plain 44-inch cotton fabric, you're going to need 2 pieces per side, just like we did with the sashing. So I'm going to attach it the same way. I'm going to do the sides first, then do the tops, and I'll bring you back when we're ready to layer this up. So this is what it looks like with the border on, and I cut my pieces 6.5 inches, I'm not sure if I said that, to get my 6-inch border. Now blue and black are my favorite colors, that's why I chose the blue. But by just changing the border color, it just gives your quilt a whole different vibe and look. So right now, to me, all the blue is popping out, but just imagine if it was a red border or a green border, that would look pretty too. So now I'm just going to move around a few things, get my table pulled out. We'll layer this up and get it tied together. All right, so I'm going to put my ties on the back. Traditionally they are on the front, but I want them on the back. So I went ahead and I put my quilt top face down. I centered it as much as possible. So now I'm just going to take my cotton batting. This is 96 inches wide, so I'm just going to measure a piece that goes across the width ways, and you want some overlap. Because we're tying this together, I'm not so concerned about wrinkles on the other side or any of that. However, if you were going to quilt this, you do want to do it on the floor. Make sure everything's nice and flat. That way you don't get any puckering. But for this, the only thing we really need to worry about is when we attach the binding. And I just find the center crease of my binding, line it up with the center of my quilt, make sure that I have a little bit of a hang off, and then smooth it nice and flat. So now we're going to do the exact same thing with our backing fabric. This is 108 inches wide, and I just like to cut it the same size as my batting. If you want to, you could make it a little bit bigger, especially if you were quilting this together. It's amazing how much the fabric kind of condenses during the quilting process, and next thing you know, you're too short on your backing. But since we're tying this together, it's not that big of a deal. So now we're just going to lay our backing fabric so that the right side is facing up. Alright, then you just want to smooth it out as best you can. If you want to go ahead and iron these wrinkles out, you can. I'm not too worried about it. Until we start putting the binding on, then I'll make sure everything's nice and flat. So now I'll just be using some black crochet thread, and I'll be using this ribbon needle. It has a bigger eye on it and kind of like a blunt tip. It's perfect for tying quilts together. And to make the tying go easier, I made a little template. This is a 12-inch square. I plan on putting 4 ties per block. So then I just divided it all out, punched some holes right there, and I'm just laying this. I can feel under here where my seam lines are. So I'm just lining this up with the block underneath, and with some chalk, I'm just making some marks. And then I'm just going to go ahead and move it up. And this is not exact. They might be a little wonky, but that's okay for me. So now I'm just going to thread my needle with my crochet thread. Maybe. So you should have a double strand of thread. So then I'm just going to go to one of my marks, making sure you go through all 3 layers. Sometimes I just check to make sure I did. I did. So next I'm just going to tie it twice and pull. You don't want to pull this first one really tight. And then just tie it 2 more times again. And this one you can pull tight. And then just go ahead and clip it to 1/4 inch little thread tails. I'm just going to go down through all 3 layers. Check to make sure that I did. I did not. I'm going to loop it around twice. Pull it tight, but you don't want it to pucker. And then 2 more loops. And then pull it tight. So I have a bunch more of these to go, so I'll bring it back when ready for the binding. So after I had this all tied together, I went ahead and trimmed around all the edges, and now it's binding time. So I took 9 2.5 inch strips of my black and I sewed them together the exact same way I sewed my sashing strips together. I then went and I ironed it in half. Now I like to attach my binding on the back first, so I like to leave a 12-inch opening, and this is right in the center of my quilt at the bottom. I like to leave a little tail, and I'm going to start right here at this pin, backstitching at the beginning and the end. And I'm going to sew all the way around until I get right to this pin, and I'm going to backstitch and stop. So we made it all the way around with our binding. I backstitch at the end here, and I actually had a full another strip left over, so you probably only need 8. So now we're just going to join our little tails together. So I'm just going to trim a little bit off of here. I'm going to lay this one over flat. So now you just want to open up one of your strips with the right side facing up, and that'll be like the little peak. I'm going to open up my other one, and I'm going to lay it face down. I'm going to stick a pin here, and then I'm just going to sew corner to corner. So after you sew that closed, now I just like to come in with my iron and iron this flat or open. And after we do that, the next step is we're going to take this back over to our sewing machine. I'm going to roll over my binding to the front. I'm going to line up the edge of my binding with my seam line, and then with a zigzag stitch I'm just going to close that down, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And just like that, we finally got our quilt top finished. Now it's actually the next day. I was editing this video and I realized all of my GoPro footage for the sewing machine was corrupted. I will link a binding video at the end of this video and another quilt video that pretty much is the exact same thing that we did here as far as finishing the quilt. I hope you liked this video. If you like this video and want to see more of my videos, give this video a big thumbs up and hit that big red subscribe button. I promise someday Stella will get her groove back, and I'll see you next time.